Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If I could ask you to take your seats, please. We have our final session of the day, the one you've all been waiting for. Hey, ethics and governance, data ethics and governance. So please take your seats and we will start. Okay. So in this session, we have five panelists who are going to give us their thoughts on what the governance and institutional issues are that should be considered when we transition, or as we transition to the digital economy. Our first speaker is Fotini Zampati, who holds an LLB in law. I'm sorry, LLB means? Bachelor of Law in European Law and Business Law. She's a legal professional with 17 years of experience. She's been working as a data rights research specialist to support the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Godin initiative on ethical and legal aspects of open data. She's responsible for research and analysis of national and international legislation on open data and intellectual property, ownership issues, and data rights compliance, and best practices across all aspects of national and European privacy and security, as well as data protection law and regulation in the agricultural sector. So, Fotini, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Doug. And I would like to thank also the GEO community for the invitation. This last session, but not least session, is something different that we have already discussed, but it's linked actually to everything that the Geodata workshop was these couple of days. I'm going to talk about the ethical considerations of data practices in the digital economy. So, of course, we all know that the digital economy is built on data. Every day, a massive amount of data is being created, collected, combined, and shared. Data is undoubtedly the new gold or the new oil. But besides the benefits, the opportunities for growth, productivity, and innovation, analyzing data and acting on insights from data can introduce variant risks. This could mean an unethical or illegal use of insights, bias, information asymmetries, lack of transparency, or shake trust if, for example, data is being used for purposes to which its original disclosures wouldn't have agreed and wouldn't have given their consent. And here actually comes the role of data ethics in the digital era. But what is ethics? Ethics are moral values and standards that indicate to members of the society how they should act. Ethics are moral principles that guide people's actions in their daily lives. Ethical standards influence the decisions that people make and why they make these decisions. And of course, ethics, like laws, date back to ancient times. People who behave ethically act in ways that they have society's best interest in mind. So the next question, what is exactly data ethics? What we are talking about when we say data ethics? So data ethics is the branch of ethics that studies and evaluates moral problems related to data, including generation, recording, curation, processing, dissemination, also algorithms, including artificial intelligence, artificial engines, and corresponding practices, in order to formulate and support morally good solutions. This is a definition from the researchers Luciano Floridi and Maria Rosaria Todeo. But there is another simpler, I would say, definition about data ethics from the Open Data Institute, that data ethics is a branch of ethics that evaluates data practices with the potential to adversely impact on people and society in data collection, sharing, and use. Ethics should be considered not only involving personal data, but also be considered in the collection and use of non-personal data. And also, we should consider data ethics with the relationship that they have with the legal compliance, such as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Compliance with relevant legislation and regulation is part of handling ethically data. And in cases where ethics and societal norms contradict legal compliance, then it's likely that laws need to be updated. And it's, I think, quite common and already known that existing legislation has been developed due to prior ethical debates. And I think that this is something that we are doing right now. And of course, data ethics is about how organizations use data. So there are, of course, many ethical issues about data management. There are gaps in data when, for example, we have a little source of data and it's used to be generated for insight, for larger populations, and there is omission in data, then we could have this lack of this omission could lead to a negative impact. So if there is an absence of certain information in a data source, then we could have bias. And of course, there is also the unlawful data collection, meaning that we don't really, most of the times, know how the data is being collected, if it's being collected legally. We have to deal with data breaches about IP laws or data protection laws. And of course, this is a huge problem, because when we have pre-existing data sources, we don't know how originally this data was collected, and this is mostly because there is no documentation, so it's a big issue. Another issue is that sharing data may harm individuals or society, and of course, another challenging issue is that we could create unfair monopolies. For example, in European Union, having explicit and exclusive arrangements about access in public sector data is prohibited because this could prevent others from benefiting from the access of public sector data. And of course, that also restricts competition. And of course, it was also mentioned during the GEO data workshop, some issues about privacy. What's going on with privacy? Are individuals reluctant on giving and sharing their data? Are there any safeguards about security, encryption, anonymization? What about transparency? Is there any transparency? And what about trust? Do people know what the companies are doing with their data? And of course, another issue is, does these companies would return the exchange of the value data? There is also issues about responsibility, accountability, data ownership, who really owns the data, who really owns the insights of data, non-discrimination, informed consent, that should always be considered, and some food for thought, some questions. For example, for what purpose was the data originally collected? For what purpose is the data now being used? What are the choices given to the affected parties? Do they know that they are actually making a choice? Who owns the resultant insight, as mentioned? What are the consequences of the data collection and analysis? What access is given to data subjects? Here are some of the most significant, in my opinion, questions that should be addressed. And of course, we should always have in mind that different people will have different opinions on what is appropriate or correct about the use of big data and analytics technology. So the big question here is, who really decides what is right? Responsible data is the duty to ensure people's rights to consent, privacy, security, and ownership around the information processes of collection with two basic principles, empowerment, meaning that users need to be active participants rather than passive data subjects, and harm avoidance. We need to ensure that we do no harm and that the way in which we use data and technology does not facilitate harm done by others. A good approach would be to develop a code of data ethics. It's a tool that really helps guide the governance of data, and practitioners in creating a code with respect for the persons behind the data. That should be a priority. Accountability and auditability for the use of data, mechanisms for tracking the context of collection, methods of consent, safeguards for privacy and security, of course, build digital trust through transparency, follow the legislation, but having always in mind that the law is the minimum bar, meaning that technology is exceeding, is well known, and legislation and regulation can really follow up the pace. And finally, products and practices should be robust, known to the team members, and regularly reviewed. The Open Data Institute has developed a tool with these major questions about an organization when collects, uses, and shares data as a team. We have already existing data ethics frameworks. Some of these, the UK government data science ethics framework, it's been updated already. In agriculture, the US Farm Bureau's privacy and security guidelines, the EU Ag Data Code, the New Zealand Farm Data really deals with these issues. And of course, the European Data Protection Board guidelines on codes of conduct, even though is about the GDPR and personal data, it could really be used as a reference for other sectors. The conclusion, sorry, it's a Greek one. The conclusion would be that nowadays more and more ethical or unethical data practice is increasing. There is a lot of discussion what's going on. So societies are facing various data challenges arising from these issues. So a good approach would be to develop these codes of ethics where there can be a balance between the benefits and risks, and trust can be built. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks very much, Fotini, for that interesting, stimulating thoughts on what is data ethics, how to go about defining that. Next up, we have Tom Orell, who comes to us from Data Ready and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. He's an experienced advocate whose expertise lies in the links between digital and data policy, sustainable development, and human rights. He founded the Data Ready Limited in 2018, having identified a need for less technical and more organization-centric research and services that focus on data governance, management, regulation, and usability. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks generally to the GEO Secretariat for inviting me. I'm also acutely aware that this panel is all that stands between you and enjoying a sunny evening in Vienna. So I will try to be relatively rapid. And I'm also very glad to be following on from Fotini, because her introduction there, focusing on ethics, I think fits very well with what I'm about to say as well. So when I was invited, we were asked to address three very broad questions for this panel. So it was really interesting, just as an exercise, to think about the best way to approach this. The first question that we were asked to talk about was to consider the governance and institutional challenges that the digital economy revolution brings, the risk of data control being in the hands of the few, and the need for transparency, and the risk of vendor monopolies in this space. So these are all broad issues, and the approach that I've decided to take is to attack all of them in turn, and not make any references to any Earth observation examples. And that, to some degree, is accidental and to some degree intentional. I think that what I've heard and what I've learned over the past couple of days is that there's a huge amount of innovation and a huge amount of really impressive work going on. And a lot of it, on the face of it, can only seem positive, and can only, it seems as if there are no downsides to all of this work. However, I think that the prospective risks arise, and this is why I think my presentation follows well from Fotini's. These prospective risks arise when the opportunity to combine other sources of data with Earth observation data emerge, and that's where things get a lot more interesting. So I think that while on the face of it, as a scientific community primarily here, you're all very focused on the products and the tools that you're developing, it is also worth keeping in mind the perspective and the possibility of misuse if your products are then combined with other sources of data and information. So to go through things in turn, the first, I think that in a nutshell, the issue when it comes to governance and institutional challenges is inequality. The terms governance and institutions generally are often thrown around quite lightly, but there are huge bodies of knowledge and very concrete infrastructures that sit beneath them in terms of, especially from a sustainable development perspective, when it comes to thinking about how to actually build up good governance and build up institutions. This all requires skilled people. It requires smooth institutional processes, accountability mechanisms, money, and all the other things and concepts that we often jumble together under the concepts of capacity. And from a development perspective, as I said, both good governance and institution building take an incredibly long time, and in fact, they're never-ending processes. So by breaking these concepts down, we're able to more accurately identify where and how new disruptive technologies can have an impact, both positive and negative. I think it's important to note as well that governance processes and institutions not only take time to evolve, but they do so at different rates. Every country and every part of the world is starting from a different base. And within this context, factoring in the disruption that the spread of the digital economy brings and all the new technologies and abilities and skills that are emerging, it's inevitable that one of the outcomes, and I think it's important to emphasize that it's not the only outcome, but one of the outcomes is greater inequality. And this inequality manifests in different ways. Inequality at the level of data producers, with those who have the capital, skills, flexibility, and other attributes to invest in new approaches and methods and to make best use of new opportunities. Inequality between countries, again, countries with effective governance processes and strong institutions, and those which don't have those effective governance processes and strong institutions, and inequalities between people. Here again, those with money and skills to access and use some of the tools that you develop, and those who don't have the requisite skills, money, or access to the tools that you develop. Another dimension of this in terms of inequality is that the digital economy revolution, as this panel has been framed in, not only creates inequality, but also exacerbates existing inequalities, given that everyone is starting from a different base. And the whole point and driver of innovation in digital technologies essentially is to create new efficiencies within economies. So those efficiencies will be most acutely felt and capitalized off of by those who can best leverage them, essentially. So there is a prospective risk of greater division. Similarly, on a very personal basis, the tools and services that are developed for consumers generally, rich consumers have access to better tools and services, and their data is more valuable than poor consumers. So again, there's a skew in the way in which products are targeted within markets. I mean, within that point as well, I think it's important to remember that there are huge proportions of the global population who don't have internet access at all yet, so will not benefit in any shape or form from all of the work that you do. And while open source and open data are absolutely great approaches and hugely beneficial, it's really important to recognize that they're still not equalizers. They don't, just because something is open source or open data doesn't mean that it's immediately accessible to everyone in the world. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The second theme that I'll speak to is misuse. And misuse comes up under the heading here of the risk of data control being in the hands of a few and the need for transparency. And again, I did a bit of thinking here about how to best present this, and I've not used any EO specific examples, but I'm about to run through what I've identified as 4 areas of prospective misuse, and I'd be really interested in the comments and questions part of the panel later to hear your thoughts on how, if at all, any of these apply to your work. But in terms of the four areas that I've identified, I've labeled them as such: benevolent misuse, moral misuse, negligent misuse, and accidental misuse. And I'll give you a few examples of each. So in terms of benevolent misuse, I think generally this comes down usually to either naivety or a desire to do good with data, but a failure to undertake proper risk assessments, to understand the risks involved, or just simply making bad decisions. And an example that I'd use here from the development sector is the example of the World Food Programme entering into a partnership with Palantir, the data mining and analytics firm, to process and find trends in its vast data sets. And World Food Programme's data sets often include biometric and other very sensitive data of food aid recipients from some of the most vulnerable parts, some of the most vulnerable populations in some of the most volatile parts of the world. So on the face of it, there's nothing unlawful or wrong in this partnership. But when you dig into it, there are issues that arise that do raise some concern. The first is absolutely around transparency, and particularly the transparency of contract terms. When the World Food Programme and Palantir first entered into this relationship, they didn't release the contract terms. And while there were promises made that, you know, this highly sensitive personal data wasn't going to be mashed up and merged and integrated with any other data that Palantir holds, in the absence of those contract terms being made public, I think it's very difficult to verify that. The other within this example, the other thing which I think is very concerning is that if you actually look back at the World Food Programme's history of data management, I think earlier in 2018, an independent audit was done of their or evaluation, sorry, of their data protection and security processes in East Africa, which was, for all intents and purposes, quite abysmal, and said that they had very poor, lax processes in place. So when you combine that fact with the partnership that they have with Palantir, I think it becomes a lot more obvious what the prospective misuse might be and what the prospective risks are to some of these individuals whose highly sensitive data is being held. The second issue is moral misuse, and I think that this is a very tricky topic, and I'm in hot water a little bit perhaps with this. But for example, here the example I wanted to give was around China's social credit system, and I think that this is a good example of moral misuse. So the intention here is to, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but basically the Chinese government in various parts of the country is piloting the use of a credit social system that uses automated surveillance tools, for all intents and purposes, to identify individual citizens and identify patterns of behavior. So citizens, for example, that walk their dogs without a leash or purchase too much alcohol in the estimation of the Chinese Communist Party can be given negative scores, and those negative scores result in sanctions on their ability to do certain things, notably their ability to travel within the country. And a lot of people have actually, it's impossible for them to now purchase train tickets or flights within China to move around. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. I'm being told I have 3 minutes left, so I'd better hurry up. The third example here is negligent misuse. And here again, I think the issue here is around a failure to do adequate risk assessments when it would be relatively straightforward to do them. The example I have here is I guess the generic class of examples that we're currently seeing quite a lot in the West around Facebook, for instance, and their seeming inability to actually regulate and monitor content on their platforms. I'd argue that there's potential negligence there in the sense that they clearly have the resources and the foresight to identify that some of these harms might have arisen. And I'd say that they have a duty to ensure that their platform is used in a safe way. The final area is accidental misuse, and I think that there's again, following on from Fotini, there's increasing risks, especially around accidental misuse as we move forward. An example here is that a couple of months ago, I don't know exactly what tool it was, but on Google, one of Google's tools, what Google called a minor glitch, basically resulted in Ghana in the short selling of cedi, their currency, causing a monetary crisis over the course of a day as a result of a small glitch in a Google system. I mean, this is a middle-income economy as well, so that I think that also highlights the inequality point of just how the power dynamics and relationships in the digital economy are very skewed. So I guess the summary in this particular category is that when we're doing our ethical assessments and putting together those frameworks, to keep in mind the prospective misuse of not necessarily EO tools directly, but if EO tools are combined with other sources of data, what are the prospective categories of misuse that might arise? Moving on quickly, the third and final area that we were asked to discuss was the risk of vendor monopolies in this space. So again, boiling it down to one word, the issue here is concentration. And it's concentration of power, concentration of wealth, concentration of knowledge, and concentration of skills. All of these are interrelated, and they're all interrelated to, especially to issues of inequality as well. But I think that this is where European legislation in particular, I think, comes into play as a very powerful force. Especially not so much the GDPR itself, but the underpinning principles and concepts which have emerged around the right to individual data sovereignty, the right to data portability, the right to be forgotten. All of these things, I think, play a very important role in enabling individuals to make better decisions about how their data is moved around. The final point I would make here is that this is also where human rights-based approaches are hugely important. To work. And a question perhaps for this community is, are the human rights-based approaches to EO data collection and things like that? I'm not aware of anything, but I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts again, either in the Q&A after this or just more broadly, about what a human rights-based approach to EO data use would look like and the types of considerations that should be kept in mind there. So just in conclusion, I would say that there are three big risk areas that I've identified around inequality, misuse, and concentration. And while I guess the main point really is that while much of the data that you produce, and which is incredibly useful and so helpful, especially in the development sector, on the face of it may appear harmless, even at high resolution, the perspective for unequal access, for misuse, and for the concentration of power and skills and knowledge in the hands of a few is very real, especially when you consider how your tools and data can be merged and combined with other sources of information as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was very, very interesting. I like, well, I don't know if I like it, but one of the phrases that you said was the power dynamics become skewed. And I think that's something that is really, we see a lot of that happening increasingly. All right, next up will be Kevin Pomfret, who is a graduate of Bates College in Washington and Lee School of Law. He's the founder and executive director of the Center for Spatial Law and Policy, recognized as a leader on legal and policy issues that impact the collection, use, storage, and distribution of geospatial information.
It's too long. You don't need it. And we don't have much time. So.
And he regularly speaks around the globe.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to talk here. And I do have to say, whoever thought it was a good idea to put a gavel here with a bunch of lawyers sitting up high really was, pushing the envelope a little bit, because several of us would very much like to reach and bang that. Although a couple of people looking at their computers or maybe dozing off would be surprised, so I will hold off. My talk today is going to be a little bit different. While I do think that ethics is an important issue in governance, I'm going to talk on more sort of on the legal side. And the point that I like to make, and some of you have heard me say this several times, is that open data and making data open is a policy decision, but creating products and services using open data is a legal one. And because of that, this community is increasingly being brought into what's happening in the digital economy and the laws and policies and regulations that are developing around data. And I think that's going to continue to grow, and partly because, as Tom mentioned, the products and services are not just Earth observation. It's being able to take those products and services and the Earth observation data and integrate them with other data, and that's when these issues really start to arise. So I wanted to start with this slide because I think in the Earth observation community, or the geospatial community as large, it's something that we're very similar in seeing in terms of different layers being integrated together to create these new products and services. And as these new technologies and sensors evolve, we're seeing all these different types of data that we can collect, whether it be with Earth observation or with drones or ground-based technologies, you name it, we're creating this new thing. As a lawyer, when I look at this, I get concerned about trying to figure out how you integrate all those different data sources that are subject to different license agreements and how you can comply. And I think that's something that is going to be increasingly complex because we look at this now, and this is what, there are 4 or 5 layers, but if you go to the next, you can have just an increasingly number of layers, and Earth observation data is increasingly an important part of that because of the good work that's being done in this community. But there's all these other data layers that are being included, and they're subject to different rules, different regulations, and they have different risks associated with them. And each is generally subject to a license. Now, there are some data sources that are made publicly available. The U.S. government has a number of those, but a lot of them are subject to licenses. And those licenses have different restrictions, and even open data has a licensing restriction, right? And so you need to understand that. And as a lawyer, I've looked at a number of these, trying to figure out how you can integrate these different sources to create the products and services that you need. So just some, at a very high level, data now is being licensed, not sold or frequently given away. And what that means is that both parties, the data provider and the data user, have responsibilities to one another. A license agreement is a legal agreement, and those set forth the different rights and responsibilities. And even if there's a term that's not in that agreement, it may still apply to you. So, for instance, even if you don't address privacy, but if your customer is going to, or the end user is going to use it as a way to violate an individual's privacy, there will be exposure that's associated with that. Intellectual property rights in terms of how you create new products and services. These are the things that are typically in agreements, and if they're not addressed, then you're leaving it up to someone else to decide how that's going to be addressed, whether it be a court or a regulator or a jury. Many people look at it in terms of a transfer of intellectual property rights. They want to make sure that they have the rights that they can use, and that's important. But it's also the other risks associated with the data. So who's responsible if the data isn't suitable for the particular use that it's being used for? Who's responsible if someone uses it for a use that it's not suited for? Now, Tom mentioned some misuses, and those are all valuable ones, but I'm thinking about the mundane misuses. Part of the benefits of geospatial information and Earth observation is that it's very versatile. You can use it for a lot of different applications, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily suited for that. And if you are concerned about how a user is going to use that data, if you're a data provider, then you want to put restrictions in the license agreement to deal with it. And so those are some of the issues as a lawyer in looking at these agreements that we deal with on a regular basis. And as your products and services are being used in different applications, on the consumer side, on the business side, or if you're a user and you're getting data from a proprietary source or even open data source, these are some of the considerations that's going to be considered. And again, as I said earlier, open data is still primarily subject to a license agreement, and it needs to be reviewed and considered, particularly if you're an organization. If you're not concerned about the legal risk, you may be concerned about the risk associated with not being seen as an organization or a country that violates different license terms or license agreements. So as I say, creating open data, I consider that to be a policy issue, and I consider it to be an important one and a very valuable one, and this community has done an excellent job in that area. But using open data is often a legal issue, and there are considerations that need to be put into place. There are many different types of open data licenses. I think in the sessions that I sat in this morning, there were a couple of discussions about different restrictions. Some are commercial, some are share alike. There are different types of limits that you can put on it. All of those things need to be considered. And if you're trying to integrate, as I showed in the first couple of slides, 4 or 5 data sets, all different, subject to different license agreements. And I think one of the things in this community certainly understands that a lot of the licensing the open data licensing comes from software, but Earth observation data is meant to be shared, right? Create products and services to share, not just within your organization or externally, but to other groups, and create maps, to create products and services, visualizations. And that's where the legal challenges come into place, because it's considered what's considered a derivative work. What type of information are you giving to people? Can they use it for another purpose? Some additional considerations, at least from my standpoint, when I think about it from a legal standpoint, is the geospatial community is an ecosystem. By that I mean it consists of governments, government agencies, NGOs, the scientific community, industry, and citizens. Each of those are subject to different legal and policy frameworks and different restrictions on what they can and can't do. So if you're trying to restrict or protect against one individual or one particular group collecting or using information, if you're a government, that's fine. But you need to understand that that data that's being collected is often fed into the ecosystem so that you can use it for other purposes and other applications. And so that's part of the process that takes place. There are a number of different laws and regulations, and I'll touch upon these briefly, that impact geospatial information management. Legal systems are very different. And so you can't develop a one-size-fit-all approach, because even the terms as to what's considered a law, what's considered a regulation, what's considered an ordinance, how the process is built, all of those factor in, and you need to consider those when you're thinking about what impact is this going to have on what my user can do with the data, or how I can use it in the way that I want. There are many different types of geospatial information, each with different risks. So we're talking about Earth observation data here, but obviously there's different types of Earth observation data. It can be from satellites, it can be from drones. The regulations around drones around the world are very different than when we're seeing around satellites. The privacy concerns around drones are much greater right now than around satellites, even though in this community we realize that they're just platforms. But your user, if he or she has a lawyer, he or she needs to look at that to see, is this data being collected from a drone? Are there particular restrictions on how I can use it? That's just one example of the different types of data that you can use. And as you think about LIDAR, radar, infrared, other types of multispectral data that are being incorporated, very valuable for this community, but with different restrictions being put into place, it raises some real challenges. Geospatial information is versatile, as I said. It can be used for a lot of different purposes, one single data set, but there are risks associated with that. And the technology is rapidly changing. Some of the things that we thought were only possible 5 or 6 years ago are now being implemented, not just here, but around the globe. When I talk about legal and policy frameworks and how they impact licensing, I think there are sort of two sets to think about. So there's legislation, there's agreements, there's treaties and other international obligations, but then there are also non-binding elements. So we talk about policies in this community, best practices and standards. All of them are integrated into geospatial information management. All of them are therefore integrated into licensing and into what you and your users can or should want to do with the data. And I think of the two types of elements. So the one type are those that directly impact the governance and accountability around geospatial information. Those that are designation and lead organization that can collect certain types of information, that are responsible for data collection and governance. Sector specific, so by that I mean drones or mobile devices. For instance, if you're trying to collect data from smartphones, there's a different set of regulations that are associated with that. And then those that are indirectly, so we talk about intellectual property rights. Who owns the data? Who owns the product or service that's created from it if you combine with 3 or 4 different data sources? Who has a right to tell you can't do that? If you're trying to generate revenue from it or trying to charge from it, who collects that money? Talked about privacy and data protection. In this community, I think that's going to be increasingly important for those, and this was touched on a little bit with some of the earlier speakers. On Earth observation, particularly from a drone, we think about it as, I have a number of conversations, you can't necessarily identify someone's face from that, but you've got a timestamp and you've got a latitude and a longitude. It doesn't take you too many other data points to figure out with a fairly high degree of certainty who that person is, where they're located, and if it's high enough resolution, what it is that they're doing. And that's what the privacy and data protection communities are concerned about. And if you look at the GDPR in California, United States, there's the CCPA. They're broadly defining location as something that needs to be protected without really understanding what that means and how you define that. And this community is going to be the one that's going to be hit the hardest from it, because unless they have a seat at the table, the regulators are going to develop laws in a way that isn't necessarily going to favor what it is that you want to do. National security issues. A lot of these technologies came out of the defense and intelligence communities, and so there's still that view that we need to protect it from a national security and intelligence standpoint, even though arguably countries around the world are collecting it and using it, but there's still that lens that communities and governments see this through. Licensing considerations, these are just some of the top issues that I see when I'm looking at a license agreement, trying to make sure that it's in compliance. I'm not going to run through this list. We've talked about most of them already. Just real briefly, because I've only got a couple minutes left, a couple of years ago, the Center for Spatial Law and Policy that I helped to found did a survey through the UN GGIM on how issues impact the collection, use, and distribution of geospatial information. It wasn't a scientific study by any means, but we got about 40 or 50 countries that went through and they looked at this, and what that shows is that for privacy had almost 80% of the respondents said that had at least somewhat of a great deal impact on how they could collect, use, and distribute geospatial information. Same with liability concerns, same with homeland and national security concerns. And then if you look at the licensing and data sharing concerns, that number goes up because that integrates all of the concerns. All of them are dealing with licensing, deals with all of those issues. So one of the ways, and I've talked to some of you about this, that I think this community can address that is through a tabletop exercise to figure out what the legal and policy issues are that impact the collection, use, and distribution of Earth observation data to deal with issues. You define a use case that uses Earth observation integrates it with other types of data to deal with an international issue, so you have different jurisdictions. And you walk through that, and you have stakeholders from the different communities represented. And those stakeholders include operational folks, but also lawyers and technical folks that sort of can work through. Can we use satellite data? Can we use drone data? If we can we use it the license that we want? Those are some of the issues that I think this community could use to help identify what concerns that face this community from a licensing standpoint, and then how best to address them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. You've managed to frighten me into not using Earth observations. But I know that wasn't the intent. Next up, Jean Dussart from the European Commission. He has a specialist in remote sensing, cartography, and photogrammetry. Beginning this year, he's joined the Earth observation sector of the Director General of Research and Innovation at the Commission, and he was in charge of various projects around the use of geospatial technology, supporting the INSPIRE directive, for example. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Douglas. Good afternoon, everybody. So I will try in this short presentation to share with you some European views on data ethics and governance. Oops, sorry. So the presentation, I will start saying a few words on data innovation, then share with you some ethical considerations on the use of geospatial data, and try to recap a bit some of the initiatives that the European Union has been taken in the last years in terms of ethicals and data governance, and more generally the digital strategy of the Commission. Then how maybe some of those legal and developments done at the EU level could be reused and could feed the debate for GEO. And I will conclude the presentation with a few words on the Eurogeo experience. So data innovation is often seen as the future prospect for an enormous increase of the European GDP, with very promising figures representing up to 4% of the overall EU GDP only by next year. So people are very excited about those opportunities, but maybe we should more see the issue of data like a lot of snakes going around mixing, with a lot of issues and challenges that we need to address. Some were already mentioned by in the previous speech, like inequality, misuse, concentration Kevin finished his presentation with the licensing issue, but there are others. There are still barriers for the free flow of non-personal data. There are issues on trustworthiness, on the condition for reusing the data, respecting privacy was already discussed. So what are we doing to try to address all those endless list of issues? We launched this initiative a few years ago of delivering a digital single market, and the Commission is through its various departments trying to contribute to build a European data economy. And that means a number of measures. It's a long list. Maybe I will not go through all of them, but I will just mention, for example, the support and the encouragement, the development of fair and open data markets, encourage member states to develop open data policies, because all member states are not necessarily at the same level, fostering the availability and reusability of the data, renovate the public sector innovation directive, foster open access, etc., etc. Again, as well, the Commission is very keen in removing barriers hindering the free flow of data while respecting the privacy. The GDPR was issued last year, and it's clear that this will remain a major concern for the European Union to ensure that the privacy principles are well respected. But we try as well to move, for example, by developing, it has been very much discussed those last days on developing codes of conduct to facilitate the switching between cloud service providers, just to avoid as well that users are locked in a specific solution, that they remain as well somehow owners of the data and their results. A good source of inspiration is a recently approved Commission communication that was approved just 2 weeks ago on building trust in human-centric artificial intelligence. It's a set of ethical guidelines. They are specifically addressing the artificial intelligence domain, but they could certainly very well be reused in our Earth observation context. They are based on a number of, you see the list of principles to respect transparency, diversity, accountability, privacy. And I really encourage you to look, if you look on a search engine for COM 2019-168, you will find the communication, and I really encourage to go through it. Of course, Commission is not the only one to start working and to try to put together, especially in the geospatial domain, to put on by writing some ethical and data governance principle. It has been done at the UN level already in 2015 with this statement of shared guiding principle for geospatial information management. It was a work of the UN GGIM working group. That was a first step. It has been pursued last year with the publication of an integrated geospatial information framework that is a set of guidelines on how countries around the world can develop their own SDI infrastructure. And you see that among the underpinning principle, you see again transparency and accountability. So it's taken very seriously. And another interesting example was released as well last year, just 1 year ago, by the UNICEF Office of Research. And that could be as well a source of inspiration. It's a checklist for ethical use of geospatial technologies, and it addresses as well the last point that was just mentioned by Kevin a few minutes ago on how to better assess risk and mitigation strategies for geospatial data capture from unmanned aerial vehicles. But he's proposing, this checklist is proposing as well a number of considerations that are worth to look at. So what does this mean in terms of access and exploitation of Earth observation data to GEOs? What could be the role of we see for the European Union is, of course, to keep supporting GEOs activities to contribute to ethical consideration. So that goes very well into the transition from data to a user-oriented GEOs. We are ready to contribute to setting up a modern data governance, fulfilling the commitments taken to keep promoting and maybe revise them, the GEOS data sharing principle, leading by example. And what we do with Copernicus program is a good example of implementing and adopting those principles. Facilitated access to EO data by contributing to the development and evolution of the GEOS infrastructure around transparency principle. We will keep supporting and launching a research action that contributes to GEOS and develop the GEOS initiative. Final recommendations is how we see how to move towards a user-oriented GEOS and not only a data-driven GEOS. So access to GeoData should remain open wherever it is stored, and we should keep promoting the reusability of data and the intelligence gained through datafication process. A user-oriented GEO required to focus first on needs and service provision matching rather than on technology development. Service providers and private sector should adhere to the GEO rules of participation, and that should be one of the conditions as well to become an associate partner to GEO for private companies. Inclusivity should be guaranteed, entailing the development of an open system of systems. I think that is still the unique value of GEOS with respect to many other advanced private solutions. Engagement with the private sector should be transparent and along open procedures. We are very keen at the European Union level to make sure that the call for tenders or expression of interest are published when we try to include and engage with private companies. And last but not least, ethics and inclusivity in governance and system design should remain a key priority of GEO. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jean, for that tour of what the Commission is doing in terms of ethics. Very interesting to see. Our final speaker for this session is, many of you know, Bob Chen. He's the director of the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, CSIN, which is a research unit of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He manages the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center, CDAC, and is principal investigator of one of NASA's human planet projects, focusing on the use of population and human settlement data in SDG indicator activities. So, Bob.
Thanks, Doug. And let me also preface this to say, since I'm on the program again, that I have a different hat here. I actually started working with GEO in 2006 as Secretary General of CODATA to work on implementation guidelines for the GEOS data sharing principles, which you just heard a reference to. And so that's actually what I wanted to talk about, and it's good, even though I temporarily dropped off the agenda, that I came back on at the end, I think, because I'm going to tackle some of the issues that have been raised here. And the good news is actually GEO has been very active in thinking about data sharing for the past 14 odd years. So how many of you know that all your member countries or participating organizations have already agreed to the GEOS data sharing principles? Do you all know that? Okay. How many of you know that in 2015 at the Mexico City plenary, you also, all your organizations agreed to a new version of the GEO data sharing principles. Anybody remember that? Okay, good. Well, anyway, I'm going to tell you a little more about that and then maybe circle back to some of the other issues. So in the first GEOS 10-year implementation plans, one of the core things was that there was an agreement negotiated between key parties to set out the data sharing principles, which in the original form talked about this concept that was probably still a little vague legally, but full and open exchange of data, metadata, and products. And then some other things that comes from an intergovernmental but voluntary organization, because nothing's binding and there's always laws that take precedence, as we've heard. But these were the original data sharing principles. In the GEO strategic plan for 2016 to 2025, there was an effort to really think about modernizing the principles. When the principles were first enacted, it was really a step forward to get this international community to agree to full and open access. By the time 2015 came around, there had already been a lot of movement, just more generally with governments, to open up data and related information. And so there was definitely a feeling that GEOS needed to stay ahead of the curve and really adopt a stronger set of data sharing principles, which are these, which you can find on the website. Which has key phrases like the data should be open by default. That is, it's not just that we're contributing data, but if it's not specified, the ideal is to have data open by default. That there are no charges or restrictions on reuse, not just for research and education. That, there still have to be some legitimate restrictions on data and use. Costs should be minimized, delays should be minimized. So some of the language is still the same, but one of the key was to move to this open by default concept. And that was accepted. Now, you notice in my title, and I think you've heard Gilberto and others refer to FAIR. FAIR is a set of principles that were published just a couple of years ago in the science community, so in a publication called Scientific Data. FAIR, F-A-I-R, stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this has become kind of a fad, as I would call it, in some circles where a number of organizations have been adopting FAIR and promoting FAIR as the way to go. There's a group called Force 11 and a bunch of others, the American Geophysical Union and others have been pushing FAIR. Now, it comes out of the science community and, what you can see from the argument, I actually think for the GEO community, it's kind of a step backwards. We have not just the data sharing principles, but a whole set of data management principles that address a lot of these issues. And, FAIR was intended for research purposes where you can often dealing with confidential and personally identifiable data, new instruments where you actually don't fully know what the data is telling you, public and privately funded research, small and large projects, whole range of disciplines covering a whole set of activities. So FAIR, I'm not arguing that FAIR doesn't have its purpose for that community, but the idea that FAIR is applicable to everything we do, I think has to be addressed. And if you look at FAIR, there's a lot of focus on the mechanics. Gee, we should have persistent identifiers. Gee, the machines should be able to read the metadata. Gee, the protocol should be open, and we should need better ontologies. I mean, these are all good things to have, but it doesn't actually get at the policy issues. Like, for example, it just says we should have clear and accessible data usage licenses. It doesn't actually say these licenses should be open, they should be compatible in various dimensions. Like, the ones that Kevin and others have said. So here's sort of my case, and I will say, even though I'm co-chair of the data sharing working group, these are my personal opinions. We haven't discussed this, although I think we will. So FAIR does not call for open data. It says it can be accessible by appropriate people in an appropriate time in an appropriate way, and you can limit access to a defined group of people. And it doesn't actually say who defines who's appropriate, when, where, and so forth. FAIR does not mean open by default. It actually says you should have a license. It doesn't say it has to be an open license. As long as you have a clear license, it meets the FAIR criteria. And Kevin referred to the fact that you start putting custom licenses that aren't open together, you get a legal mess that it takes an expensive lawyer to sort out. FAIR doesn't say anything about no charges or restrictions on reuse. Doesn't say anything about the cost of reproduction and redistribution or any kind of criteria. And it says under FAIR you can use more restrictive licenses. It doesn't say that those licenses might have charges and licensing and so forth, or restrictions on what other people can do with the data commercially or not. So there's a lot of problems with just saying, hey, the data's fair, because that means it is not open. It does not meet the agreed GEOS data sharing principles. It doesn't say anything about time delay, and actually talks about you can keep it private until publication, and you know how long publication takes, or stretches of time. That's like the vaguest term you can imagine. So, as many of you know, we do already have data management principles that cover a lot of the topics in FAIR, things like, provenance and verification and so forth. We, members and participating organizations, you see, already have processes in place that go beyond FAIR. And I think, it's, from my viewpoint, it's important for GEO to keep pushing this wider, more open approach. So we need to, continue to support open access by default. Obviously we all want machine readable licenses, but they really should, follow on the kinds of exercises and experience that Kevin and others were talking about, that they ought to be interoperable. You shouldn't have to have a lawyer read all the agreements. A machine's going to have a hard time sorting out all the different legal language that's possible in a license. We want to encourage free where that's possible. We want to encourage the private sector. Sure, they're not going to open up all their holdings, but to support free and open access, even as a marketing tool or whatever, to get people to be able to use data in a much more equitable and open way. To automate and interoperate everything so that the delays are minimal. And I just wanted to conclude, why do we want to do it? It's because we need even more rapid scientific progress. I mean, climate change is happening. It's now, we need solutions now. Openness supports that. We need trust and collaboration so that everybody understands the other people's data and can share it. It's not our data versus your data. It's our collective data that we're building our models and our understanding on. Clearly, we want to be efficient, not duplicate, expand capabilities because we're using our resources and not duplicating data collection and creating more problems. And if you think about the Sustainable Development Agenda, having these open data allows even the people who may not directly have internet to be identified, counted, included, and hopefully not left behind. Again, these are my personal thoughts. I heard through the grapevine that there is a suggestion that the data sharing working group should be asked, and the Evolve data management people, to look at FAIR more closely and do a crosswalk. So I imagine that'll happen. I think this cartoon's appropriate for all the geeks and nerds in here that yes, programming is important, but we have big issues the reason for it is to tackle these big issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. It's interesting to see how FAIR compares with the data sharing and data management principles. So thanks for highlighting that. All right, we've come to the end of the presentations now. I'd like to open it up for some questions. And again, please use Slido. We have some questions coming in. So as usual, I'll start off here with a few questions from Slido and then maybe open up to the floor for any questions more spontaneously. So a question here from Miko Schollendorf. He says, are there laws on protecting endangered species that regulates how data would be shared? Yeah.
Well, maybe I can say for the European Union, there is the Natura 2000 Habitats Directive that protects the dissemination of information on endangered species. So member states have to report to the European Environment Agency providing all the information. But then when the European Agency redisseminate this information, harmonizing between all the member states, they hide a number of attributes. Like in Austria, it's clear that they will never say where Edelweiss are located.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Kevin. Can you comment briefly on the advantages and drawbacks of Creative Commons for licensing Earth observation data?
I think the advantage is that it's a known license that has been around for a number of years. And there are several variations that people can use, so it gives you some flexibility in determining what it is that you want to use and how you want to use it. The disadvantages are, one, that there's a number of different options that you can use and how you want to use it. So you can get several people that are trying to, have different perspectives and still think they're licensing under Creative Commons, so it should be open. But from a user standpoint, it can be difficult. The other challenge that I see, and this isn't just with Creative Commons, but just in open data license in general, is they're not geared for geospatial and some of the unique aspects of geospatial, even defined terms as to what's considered publication, what's considered derivative products. And so for people in the community, it can be difficult to figure out how to apply a Creative Commons license, what it is that you want to use when you aggregate it with other data.
So I just want to add that, and I may have a bias because I was on the Science Commons committee for a while, so helped with, gave input into the 4.0 version of the licenses. Within my data center, we worked closely with our institutional lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, to do an evaluation of CC by 4.0 for our data, which we have now applied, but it was an extensive legal analysis. One of the benefits of it is it did provide the liability protection that was sufficient for Columbia University, at least, that other licenses didn't have. That analysis only applies to the sense that this license was appropriate for my center based in the United States is limited to the fact that we're based in the United States. And so others in other countries would need to do their own analysis to understand whether CC by 4.0 provides the kind of openness and legal protection that they would like. I'm glad Kevin's nodding. So, but, it's one of the few that meets lots of other criteria that make it at least from my viewpoint, a viable solution. I did forget to mention that the Data Sharing Working Group has issued implementation guidelines, which Maddie was checking to see if it was not online for some reason, but these have been accepted by GEO, and there is guidance out there for any groups that want advice on exactly these issues of what licenses are appropriate and why.
I just also had a very brief point that one of the other benefits of the CC BY 4.0 is that it is interchangeable with other licenses, and I think that's something to keep in mind. The pro forma CC BY licenses are not always ideal for every situation, but they can form part of a broader framework. So to give you an example, in the UK, across government, the government uses something called the Open Government License, and the Open Government License has a specific provision within it that enables reuse under a CC BY 4.0 license, thereby making it interchangeable for all intents and purposes. So that's one of the ways in which you can overcome some of these jurisdictional issues as well, but it does require that there's a degree of harmonization and collaboration in how these frameworks are put together.
So just to follow up a point that Bob made earlier, and that I was trying to make, those are both open licenses, the UK license and the Creative Commons license, but they require, to quote Bob's, expensive lawyers to sit down and go through and make sure that you can make them compatible. And that's the challenge, right? I mean, we talk about open by default, we talk about open data licenses, but everyone tweaks it a little bit. And if you're a big organization or well-funded or you're worried about your prestige, like Columbia, you need to spend a lot of time going through it and looking at it and making sure that it can work. And my sense in this community, and I probably say this a little bit out of frustration, is that this community, and by this I mean Earth observation, but geospatial in particular, will spend a lot of time and money developing new platforms, new portals, new systems to collect and share data, but when they come to a legal issue in terms of how we're going to be able to share it and to get the users to where we want, they throw up their hands instead of rolling up their sleeves and try to figure out how to deal with it. And they say, well, that's a legal issue, that's the lawyer's problem, that's something that we can't deal with. And that's unfortunate because a lot of other communities are dealing with the same issue. The software community had to deal with it with open software a bunch of years ago, but you have to roll up your sleeves and you have to sort of figure out how to make it work if you want the success and the benefits that this technology can provide. That's my perspective.
Okay, so to kind of follow up on that, there's another question here. It's a lawyer's job to scare people, but one has the sense from the presentations that we've seen that the Earth observation community is actually headed for a fall, especially around privacy. Would you agree? And I'll just throw it open to anybody who wants to respond.
In a word, no. I don't think that that's right. I don't think it's also right to say that everything is negative. I mean, I think it's important that we're aware of risk. And the position that I often take and that I try to explain to people who ask for advice on these points, especially around privacy, is that the starting point and the assumption has to always be that there's always going to be a degree of risk. There always has been a degree of risk. Anything that involves any kind of information or data sharing, regardless of domain or information type, there's a degree of risk. That's fine. The issue is to understand exactly how that risk manifests and the prospective harms that it might result in down the line. And those foreseeable harms are what most jurisdictions, and to my knowledge at least, will take into account if this becomes an issue, right? What a judge would do is sit in court and say, so at the time that you're developing this, is it likely that it would have been foreseeable that that type of risk or that type of harm would flow from your activity? So if you can identify those harms and you can take reasonable steps to mitigate against them and identify, if I do X, Y, Z, I can reduce that risk by a significant degree, that's generally sufficient. So I think it's really important to just understand and start from a point of embracing the fact that there's always going to be some kind of risk, but just to ensure that processes and systems are in place to be able to identify those and to take any reasonable action that you can that's proportionate to the risk to minimize it as much as possible.
I would add and say that not only GEO community is facing these difficulties and challenges about the legal issues, like Kevin mentioned. We do need to work more as lawyers. These issues are also burning not only for organizations, NGOs, but also for us lawyers. There are challenges, there are difficulties, although still I am optimistic, meaning that we need to change this mentality. We need to involve more. For example, GEO right now, as the session has added this ethical session, meaning that it's looking towards the ethical and legal aspects more to be involved. There's also these data sharing guidelines and implementation guidelines. So I think specifically for GEO, they are moving to the right direction. Still, it's a long way ahead, and really need to focus on these issues because, like earlier I mentioned, that of course technology is a great tool for mankind, but we should never forget the legal perspective with the licenses, the privacy and security issues. But nevertheless, I think that we are on the right track.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to disagree with my old friend Tom. And not being the lawyer, I think we have to take this really seriously. I mean, there was just the anniversary of the Italian earthquake, and if you remember that a bunch of earthquake scientists who didn't quite deliver earthquake predictions in the way that they were perceived to should have delivered it were arrested and put in jail and got in lots of legal trouble. You know, there's lots, even if there's not legal risk, there's a lot of perceptual risk related to obviously what Facebook and others are going through. We've been working closely with Facebook on some data which, you know, has been released under a Creative Commons license, but not all of it has, because there's concern that some of this high resolution data in conflict countries could be used not just for good, but fairly easily for bad. And, you don't have to be a lawyer to want to avoid those kinds of potential misuses that we heard about. So, I think collective discussion, analysis of those situations, actions by GEO to establish best practices, what's reasonable, what's not, is important to helping people, both be safe, but also push the envelope when it's important. But it's not just their own themselves going out on the limb, but that we've had actual discussion and some legal evaluation when that's needed. So I think risk is there and needs to be dealt with, proactively.
Hey, Kevin, go ahead and comment, and then Gilberto has a response.
Yes, lawyers are supposed to identify risk and point that out, and some of us tend to be risk adverse, others are less risk averse. I think you are less risk averse if you understand the technology and the applications and what the law is and where it's going. You can give more confidently the advice that yes, you can do X or yes, you can do Y. Unfortunately, in this community, there aren't a lot of lawyers that have that expertise, and the law is changing along with the technology and the application, so it's a real challenge. From a privacy standpoint, I think the greatest risk is that the privacy data protection train is going down the path, and laws are being developed globally, and they're worried about location information, and they're putting it in their statutes and their regulations and their laws and their policies, and no one's defining it because they don't know how to define it. And if this community is complacent and is not part of that discussion, the challenge is not that you're not going to be able to do the things you're doing now, I don't think. It's going to be you're not going to be able to do things that you want to do in the future and you want your end users to do, to be able to integrate the Earth observation data with other types of data that can be very valuable, because the privacy laws will make it one, too expensive, or two, too difficult to get your lawyer to agree to how to do it. And that's been coming, but now the momentum is picking up, so I do worry that this community will feel that impact and start feeling that impact in the next couple of years in some segments.
Well, first, in the behalf of the whole GEO community, and certainly as the GEO Secretariat Director, I want to most welcome your participation here, that you had accepted our invitation, because I think you're just touched on points, and I'd just like to one point that you hadn't touched, just to provoke you a little bit more. There is one aspect of Earth observation that was not highlighted but was implicit in what you said, is that Earth observation data is invasive. It's invasive in the sense that from 20 years ago, the kinds of things that we do in Earth observations now were only available to surveillance agencies. Now you can have Planet at 3 meters resolution, which was, there was what the United States and the USSR had in the Cold War. So it's invasive. And I would like to stress that we need you, because the privacy question, when we deal with global arrangements, it's much more complicated than you think. Is it right to invade the privacy of a farmer who has deforested illegally an area in Amazon, in his farm? Is it right to expose him? Because is the protection of the common environment worth the fact that you are exposing an action that takes place inside a private property, which is how we managed to put deforestation down in Brazil, by the way. So privacy concerns in the global environment where we're using the global commons have to be balanced with our ability to invade some countries which is not reporting well his compliance to the Paris Agreement. So we need you. And how do you think we can even start to approach this problem of the privacy of the individual versus the use of the global commons?
Oh, yeah, I always have opinions about this. But I think you're right on target. That's a huge issue that few people are thinking about as the trade-off between important issues related to national security and sovereignty versus and control versus the global needs and the global commons and the internationalization of science and other things. Those are reflective of the larger tension that we have between, which is one reason why we're still changing the climate even more faster than, predicted because we've had climate predictions for the past 40 years that were still pretty accurate, and we haven't done things about it, but it reflects some of those exact same tensions. I don't know that we can solve all of them just through data and information as a example, but I think it is a balance that we have the structure in GEO to at least tackle that part, to get as much openness and sharing and trust of those data, so that even countries that feel like they're being invaded get enough benefit from the broader sharing that they still will participate and play in the system, versus everybody, segmenting literal silos from the Earth, to space, which we could revert to.
I think that's an excellent question, and you absolutely hit the nail on the head, right? That's exactly the issue, and that goes back to the point earlier about the ability to combine different data points, because that's how you'd identify that particular farm, etc. It's also the reason that in the previous panel I asked Stephen the question that I asked from Ghana about how Farmline does it in terms of identifying identifying farmers there and contacting them. And actually, I was very impressed by the answer that I was given in terms of they take the time to go and get consent, to register users, to create agreements, etc., and to make it clearer. Now, that's not going to work in every situation, right? And another question I can think of, thinking about the Amazon in particular, is what gives us the right to monitor uncontacted indigenous peoples living in the forest as well, and how do we develop the ethical frameworks there? But I think that the lessons are actually there, because that's actually a really good example of how protection can be done in a way which balances invasiveness with the need to protect. So I think that we can learn lessons from other movements which have done similar things, and we can learn lessons perhaps from GEO members or those who are using the tools and the data that are being produced by the GEO community. I think Stephen's response to my question earlier was really good in terms of the approach and the model that they take.
Yes, I want to add as well to this that maybe there as well some technical solution to address those privacy issues. We see that with the common agricultural policy in Europe, or the common fishery policy, that of course we want to respect privacy. We don't want to flag a particular farmer or a specific fisheries vessel because they go fishing in area where they're not supposed to be. And we all know that there are statistical methods to aggregate data, to generalize data. So I think that certainly the GEO community can provide some technical solution to find this right balance between the obligation for the public authority to check the environmental compliance of its rule, of its regulation, like both farmers and fishermen receive subsidies from the community, but they have to respect rules. So it's our duty as a public authority to check that they are effectively respecting their commitments. But of course, this information should not fly all around and without respecting the privacy.
So when I talk about geolocation and privacy, I often will just have a big bucket as an image, because the point I'm trying to make is that privacy is the bucket that we put in whenever we have concerns over new technology. And if we're uncomfortable with it, a lot of times we talk about it from a privacy standpoint because we don't have other words to describe it. And I think geospatial is in that right now in Earth observation, because people are very concerned, and rightfully so, about what these new technologies can and might be able to do, and they don't necessarily understand how it's being used. And I get it at some sense, but I also think that in many countries there are probably analogous situations that you can use, find laws that you can look at and say, in the U.S., for instance, there are laws in place or cases that you could look at and say, okay, you can use the data for this, you can't use it for that, or the government can use it for this, but the industry can't use it for that. And so I think a lot of it is just education for this community, and frankly, educating lawyers and policymakers and regulators about the technology and how it can be used. To go back to my last slide, one of the benefits of a tabletop exercise involving a use case is you can sort of look at those issues at the granularity to see, can we do this in this particular country? If we can't, why not? And if we can't, what else can we use to be able to get to the same situation? So the example that Jean gave was, you can use, if you're giving them money, then you do probably have a legal obligation to check on what they're doing there, right? If they don't, maybe you have some other thing that you can use, another technology. But those are the type of things that I think this community could benefit from in thinking through, because if you don't do it, no one else is out there doing it for you. Lawyers aren't learning about this. Policymakers aren't really paying attention to this. If you don't do it yourself, you're going to be stuck with whatever someone else comes up for you, is my sense.
Okay. One last question. Laurent.
It's maybe not a question, but listening to all the debate and discussion, I'm just wondering, can you raise your hands including the panelists, if you know about the 1986 principles or the United Nations principles of the remote sensing of the Earth by satellite. There's very few. I mean, probably we should read it again, and if these are concerns, let's put them on the table again, because back then all the member states of the UN agreed that remote sensing of the Earth by satellite is fine and should be done and should be shared. So I don't know what's the response. I don't want to delay the whole discussion, but I just wanted to point out that we have that. We have those principles, and they are valid since 1986.
Great. And I would just add that times have changed quite a bit since then, and if you were to try to bring that to a vote of the UN, and it's not a treaty, they're principles of remote sensing, and if you were to try to bring that to the UN today, you'd probably get a very different response. But your point is well taken. They do exist, and they are relatively binding for those countries that agreed to them.
And yeah, well, just one plug I forgot to put in my slides, which is the data sharing working group still exists. It may become a foundational task or something. Our participation's been kind of dropping off, so if new people are really interested in this, we could really use your help and input, and maybe even tackle some of these, pressing issues. So, mechanism exists. Leave it to the program board and others about what happens to us, but I think it's worth pursuing.
Okay, Tom is yielding to Jana.
Thank you, and shoot, I just missed what Bob said because we were having a little sidebar here, but I just wanted to not miss the proposal or the recommendation that came from Kevin. I always love when the slide concludes with a specific recommendation or action. But from all the nodding and the comments, it seems like there is an agreement that this is something worth taking a look at and producing new or updated analysis or piece of knowledge. And I wonder if something like a side event in Canberra could be a place to bring together some of the practitioners that Kevin talked about, and execute this kind of an exercise that will at least elucidate what's there. We're talking a lot about tying the whole knowledge hub and much of what GEO does to SDGs, and SDG monitoring in itself is supposed to draw on all these types of data from all these types of sources. So it seems like that could actually provide a backdrop for a tabletop exercise, an example of that. I'm just throwing it out as an idea. But most importantly, I just want to kind of cling to that proposition and see if there is actually an appetite to take it on as a further action and plan something with participation of key entities and parties for a potential side event in Canberra.
Well, okay. I think we heard that recommendation. Maybe we'll talk about it in the Secretariat to see how we could do a canvas and see what interest there is for that.
I was just going to say very, very briefly, I think that's a really good thing. And based off Kevin's presentation, his recommendations, I think it would be super helpful if this community in particular could focus on what they mean by location data and set a series of principles around when and how that should be used and used sensibly. The other term that I would raise awareness of and suggest be focused on by a working group is automated processing. Because automated processing appears across European legislation. Now, it appears within the GDPR Article 22, but it remains undefined. So there's no definition for that. And that goes directly to questions around the use of AI. But if you could define, at least for the purposes of EO data and the context in which you operate, how automated processing is applied, the conditions under which it's applied, and the principles which are used to apply it, you'd be ahead of the curve when it comes to helping to persuade legislators, policymakers, and lawyers about what these terms mean. So I think to focus as a starting point on those definitions would be very helpful.
And just certainly since I suggested it in my slides, the center would be interested in supporting that. And I think there are other I think you're right about the processing, and there are other definitions that could come out of an exercise such as that then could be fed back into an open data licensing regime or data sharing principles, because you can define what is, location data, what is automated processing, what is derivative product, what is, the lawyers can come up with a handful of those that you can do. And if you can get some consensus on that, at least within this community, so that everyone starts using this data, understands what that is when they are signing up for something, it will make things, I think, a lot easier and a lot smoother, and basically enhance the value of the Earth observation data itself.
Just to continue with what Kevin and Tom suggested, I think that this could be done with a code of conduct somehow for GEO, including all the definition about location data, about the licensing agreements, about privacy, all this. I think that it could be included in a code of conduct.
Okay, I think we have to draw the discussion to a close there. I think I'm sensing that there's interest in Jana's proposal for some kind of a side event, maybe in Canberra, around this issue. So I think we are not going to sit here and figure out the process right now, but we'll discuss it in the Secretariat and see what we can come up with. So thanks for that. Thanks to our panelists for interesting discussion. That brings us to the end of the Data Technology Workshop. I'd like to thank all of you for your participation and your active comments and questions. In particular, we would like to thank UNUSA for their tremendous support, in particular Nina Kickinger, Maria Ringer, and Christoph Santo Domingo and the whole team. So thank you very much for your support. We will likely have another event like this, probably combined with the Data Providers Workshop. We may look at having maybe a 4 to 5 day event where we have them back to back. That's something that is in active discussion in the Secretariat as well. So we'll hopefully have a chance to get together again and explore these issues further. So that's it. I'm just going to turn it over now to Gilberto, who's going to give us his closing remarks.
Well, my closing remarks are, of course, with immense thanks to everyone. This was a very dense workshop and wonderful presentations and extremely exhaustive, but content-wise fantastic. So my thanks to everyone who came, who did the presentation, who made the questions. Thanks to Noza, thanks to Nina, thanks to Paola from the Secretariat, who did a wonderful job as well. Thank you. Very important. So I think we did it. We managed to get together a complete diverse set of people coming from different sides by looking at the problem of how to enter this new era of massive technology for Earth observation data. Thanks to all of you, and see you next year, hopefully.